The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another edition of IRENA Insights webinar series. My name is Martina Lyons, and I'm from the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center in Bonn. A small introduction of who we are. IRENA is an intergovernmental organization with currently 161 member countries and with 22 countries in accession. We support countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future and serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, a center of excellence, and a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. Our analytical work and our engagement with our members generates a lot of valuable insights, and we are constantly looking for more ways to share those insights with you. And that's why we launched this fortnightly IRENA Insights webinar program, where every other week we share with you key findings from our latest work, offer you insights into opportunities, trends, best practices, but also innovative solutions to address various challenges. A small caveat, we aim to keep these webinars short, approximately 30 minutes maximum, so we cannot cover everything, but we do hope to give you enough so that you can decide whether to delve deeper into the topic. And we will also signpost in our presentation further sources of more in-depth information to help you do that. So today's webinar will talk about IRENA FlexTool and will focus on how to assess power system flexibility to integrate a higher share of renewables. In 2018, IRENA published the report Power System Flexibility for the Energy Transition, together with the publicly and freely available tool IRENA FlexTool. This tool was then used to perform flexibility assessment for Colombia, Panama, Thailand, and Uruguay. Today's webinar will review the concept of flexibility, which was proposed 2 years ago, and will present you with the latest version of the Flex tool, which was launched just a few weeks ago. So today's speakers are Mr. Emanuele Taibi and Mr. Carlos Fernandez, our IRENA's Power System Transformation Strategies experts. Their presentation will be maximum 20 minutes long to allow another 10 minutes for your questions. But before I hand over the microphone to Emanuele and Carlos, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. Next, please. Today's webinar will be, as usually, recorded and available together with the presentation slides on IRENA webinar website under past webinars on the bottom of the site. The previous webinar recordings and slides are already there, and we invite you to visit them. The link to the website will be again shared with you in the follow-up email. All of you are currently muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. Next, please. We would love to hear from you during today's presentation, so if you have any questions for our speaker, please feel free to send it through the question feature that you can find on the webinar panel. We will be monitoring your questions throughout the session and select some to be answered by our speakers. But due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered. And you may also download the presentation slides in a handout section that include all important links to IRENA FlexTool material on IRENA website. If you experience any technical difficulties, please try to reconnect by dialing in via phone, and you can get the number by clicking on the phone option located on the webinar panel. You can get and otherwise, please visit support service on the GoToWebinar website. So without any further ado, let me kick things off by welcoming Emanuele. Emanuele, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martina, and welcome everyone to this webinar series issue of IRENA Insights focusing on flexibility. So we will have a split presentation with my colleague Carlos Fernandez. I will give a little bit of a introduction on the settings, so energy transformation, where we are today, where we are heading, what is the role of flexibility on getting where we need to get for a Paris compliant system, and in particular power system. And then I will hand it over to Carlos to give you a basic introduction about the IRENA FlexTool. So you should all see my next slide now. As a matter of introduction, we just released the first IRENA Global Renewables Outlook a few weeks ago, where we looked at the transition pathways to get to a Paris compliant power system and energy system as a whole between here and 2050. So a few key elements comparing today with where we need to get in the transforming energy scenario, which is our Paris compliant scenario. as I mentioned. So renewable energy in the power sector is today at 25%, and we need to get to 86%. And what you can see on the left-hand side in terms of energy, the current contribution in terms of renewable is dominated by hydropower, with bioenergy, solar, and wind all contributing in similar manners. And when we look at the capacity that we're going to have in 2050, you will see how significant solar and wind become. So the yellow being solar, the light blue being wind, in achieving this 86% renewable share. So what does this mean for a power system? Solar and wind are variable resources, so they have limited predictability and they have inherent variability. And what we need to make sure the system operates reliably and efficiently is, of course, to have sufficient flexibility. So as part of the global renewables outlook, we also have numbers for flexibility. So in addition to the significant increase in solar and wind that you can see on the right-hand side, there is also a significant increase for enabling technologies such as stationary storage, pumped hydro, batteries, and others, but also what we call storage on wheels, which are the electric vehicles. Electric vehicles being able to do smart charging helps significantly in availing part of the storage capacity to the power system to provide flexibility. But in addition to this, we also have production of green hydrogen, so the electrolyzers can operate flexibly, and we will have significant amounts of those in the system. We will not focus too much on that today, but just important to mention. And of course, we can store this gas, decoupling the demand from the supply. And the same applies for power to heat. So heat pumps, for instance, are another important flexibility source, also resistive heating. And again, we have thermal storage downstream that can allow to decouple heat demand from electricity supply, especially as far as solar and wind are concerned. So how does this look in practice? Well, two key messages in this slide. This is some power system flexibility analysis we did based on the GROW numbers. And what you can see is that, number one, it works. So this is the UK as an example, sample week from 2050 in the UK, where you see a system that is able to balance demand and supply at all times. We are talking times at a hourly level. We are not, in this case, talking about the stability of the system or inertia and similar factors, which are equally important, but outside of the scope of this talk today. And the other thing you can see from this chart is that this is a very different power system. But what you see below the axis is in green hydrogen production, which can be interrupted when there is maybe scarcity of supply, and can be started again when there is low cost available supply. And there is also a very spiky behavior of smart charging of electric vehicles. The two colors distinguish smart charging and what is called vehicle to grid. But the key message is that it's really important to be able to tap into storage quickly to respond to the quick variations in solar and wind that you see above the x-axis. The yellow, the light blue, and the slightly darker blue are solar and wind. In the case of the UK, you have a 15 gigawatt interconnection, but as you can see, you reach 110, 115 gigawatts of generation in certain moments, with significant EV smart charging happening on the other side of the axis. This brings us to the work that we've been building around the topic of flexibility over the last 2.5 years in our team. So essentially, we came up with a definition of flexibility that speaks to solar and wind generation. So essentially, the capability of the power system to cope with this variability and uncertainty that comes from large shares of solar and wind at all time scales, really, from the very short to the long term, avoiding curtailment and reliably supplying all the demand energy. And so this is not just flexible generation, but it's also increased transmission and better utilization of the same, storage of all types, demand side management, and sector coupling. And sector coupling specifically, as I mentioned, power to heat, power to gas, in particular green gas like hydrogen and derivatives, and power to electromobility. And this is also mirrored on the right-hand side by the IRENA camel curve that shows how the flexibility spreads from supply throughout the system for a, let's say, flexible enough system with high shares of variable renewables. This is part of a work stream. The work stream started with a package of 4 items that we released starting in November 2018 over time. So we released an overview of flexibility for policymakers, what needs to be taken into account in this space. Then we looked at a methodology to quantitatively assess flexibility. And then the next step is the FlexTool, which is the focus for today's presentation. So together with the VTT Research Center of Finland, we had an excellent collaboration, and we released the first FlexTool 1.0 back in end of 2018, and a few weeks ago the 2.0. And Carlos will give you more information about this. And the application of the tool to member countries, initially with 4 country case studies, with Colombia, Uruguay, Panama, and Thailand. Again, excellent collaboration with our members and the in-country experts. And now we move to a regional approach. So we have a very good collaboration with the countries in Central America, an advanced stage and a starting stage with the ASEAN, so the Southeast Asia region. So at this point, I'm ready to hand over to Carlos. Just a few words on the tool. So as I just said, we recently released the 2.0 version, and this is accompanied by a comprehensive set of training materials to learn for yourself or to organize internal or external trainings. The tool is open source, and as such, it can be used, downloaded, and reshared freely. Please just acknowledge where it comes from. And essentially, the 2.0 version is a very comprehensive tool that allows you to do a variety of, let's say, very advanced analytical exercises, and the training materials cover all these features. So at this point, I hand it over to my colleague, Carlos Fernandez.
Okay, thanks a lot, Emanuele, for the introduction on the topic and on the tool. I will be now explaining the main features of the tool, as well as the new features that we implemented in the version 2.0 launched in April 2020. So what are the flexibility issues that we detect with the IRENA FlexTool? So the main flexibility issues are non-supplied energy, VRE curtailment, reserve inadequacy, spilled water from reservoirs, and transmission congestions. And on the right-hand side, you can see a figure of what will be a flexibility issue detected by the tool. In this figure, you can see a dummy model from an invented country with a high penetration of solar PV, forming what we call the duck curve, and a very inflexible thermal generation mix. So what happens in this system is that when the solar PV generation ramps down, the thermal mix doesn't have enough ramping up capability in order to cover all the demand that solar PV is not covering anymore. So we can see that in the peak of demand, the thermal generation cannot really cover this peak, and loss of load is produced. So in this case, we will have to consider some flexibility options in our system in order to fix this issue. Next, please. So in terms of how the IRENA FlexTool fits in our planning process, here you can see a figure on where the tool fits. But basically, in a planning agency or at the planning department or the Ministry of Energy, they usually use capacity expansion models or energy planning models, such as MESSAGE, which is the one we use in the agency. And these models doesn't capture a very high granularity in order to be able to capture flexibility issues. So they are not capturing ramping capabilities, they don't capture well storage, etc., etc. So we developed FlexTool a bit to take the results from these capacity expansion models that analyze the long term, and to go a bit deeper onto flexibility and see if these expansion plans are are okay from the point of view of flexibility. So what we do is we take 1 year, for example, 2030, if the national plan goes up to that horizon, and we analyze that year in FlexTool and feedback again the long-term model. Just to mention that FlexTool doesn't capture the seconds and sub-seconds scale. This will be done with power grids analysis software, such as the commercial ones that everyone knows. So FlexTool looks at the horizon of 1 hour, but if there's data available, we can do 30 minutes, 15 minutes analysis with the tool as well. Next, please. So on how to engage with IRENA in order to use the tool or to learn how to use it, we have usually 2 options. The first one is engagement with the agency in order to develop the analysis ourselves. In this case, we engage with the relevant stakeholders, which would be, for example, the Ministry of Energy or the TSO, and we perform the analysis in close collaboration with our counterpart. The second option is the organization of, currently, because of the situation, a virtual training on the IRENA FlexTool. And we preferably do this on a regional basis and not on a national basis. So, for example, last week we just had a training for all the relevant stakeholders in Latin America. In terms of objectives of the kind of analysis that we do with FlexTool, in the right-hand side you can see a summary, but basically it's what I have explained in the previous slide. So we take the national expansion plans for let's say 2030, but it can also be any other year. We analyze the potential shortages and flexibility issues from this expansion plan, if any. In case there are flexibility issues, the second step we do is we use the investment mode of the FlexTool in order to suggest some flexibility options to invest into in order to fix these issues. And as a tertiary and maybe an optional analysis, we do a stress test into the power system in order to see when flexibility issues will start to appear. So what we do is basically we start increasing progressively solar PV and wind penetration, and we check when VRE curtailment or non-supplied energy arises. Next, please. So these were a bit the main features of FlexTool. Now I'm going to explain what have we've been improving since we launched it in 2018, and I'll explain here the main features of FlexTool 2.0. So on one side we have a set of technical enhancements. I'm not going to go through all, but they are shown in the left-hand side. So for example, in this new version, we have implemented a constraint, a minimum inertia constraint, which is very important in countries that has a very high penetration of variable of non-synchronous generation. To consider this, we have implemented a self-discharge constraint for storage. We have also implemented an efficiency time series. So, for example, now what we can analyze with this efficiency time series, what we can capture is how the efficiency of a heat pump varies with temperature. So essentially, what we do is to an exogenous calculation using a historical temperature time series, and we can calculate the efficiency of the heat pumps. And we have implemented, for example, detailed modeling of CHP units. Then on the graphical side, there have been also some enhancements. Now the input data file and the results file are much more clear than in the first version. have this new logo of the tool. For this version, we have to also acknowledge the VTT Technical Research Institute of Finland, who were together with IRENA, the main developers of the tool. Next, please. Emanuele has already gone through all the IRENA publications on flexibility and the different case studies for Panama, Colombia, Thailand, and Uruguay. Here, only to mention that we've been doing now capacity building for regions. As I said, we had the first one for Latin America last week. We are planning capacity building for ASEAN and Middle East and North Africa regions. However, these are events only that are only by invitation, but we expect in the future to be able to upload the recording of this, or maybe to upload some recording of trainings. Next, please. Just to conclude the presentation, there's also a lot of other relevant work that the Power Sector Transformation Strategies team from IRENA has been developing in the last few months. In the beginning of this year, we launched the Electricity Storage Valuation Framework, which is a 5-steps methodology on how to better value electricity storage in power systems, which is usually not properly accounted for. Then we launched the Demand-Side Flexibility Analytical Brief that explains the main solutions existing currently to provide demand-side flexibility, and it comes with a lot of practical examples. We have 2 reports on renewable hydrogen. One was launched in the IRENA Innovation Week in 2018, and the other one in the Hydrogen Ministerial Meeting in Japan. And they explain all the explain a lot of things on renewable hydrogen, its cost predictions, and how will they compare with hydrogen produced from other sources. And finally, we have the work on renewable mini-grids that analyzes the best sources of energy in order to provide access to refugee camps. So with this, I'll conclude the presentation. Thanks a lot for your attention, and we will be now happy to take any question from the audience.
Thank you, Emanuele and Carlos. Very, very insightful and very pertinent, with a lot of hands-on experience information. But without any delays, let me go directly to the questions we have received so far, and thank you all for posting them. So let me start with this one. Is it possible to model sector coupling options with the FlexTool? For example, electrolyzer for the production of hydrogen, or heat pumps for heat? Thank you.
I can take this one. Of course, it is a very important feature that we don't see prominently available in many of the tools that are somehow designed before these large shares of variable renewables became so prominent in many power systems, as we're experiencing during these days of low demand and relatively windy and sunny conditions, at least over Europe. And this is detailed and explicitly modeled, and it's available also in terms of templates. So when you download for free the FlexTool, you will find some template input files, and we have a dedicated template for power to heat, power to electromobility, and power to hydrogen.
Great, thank you. And there were a couple of questions about whether people can use this tool for their own research purposes, or whether they need a permission from IRENA. Emanuele.
Okay. We mentioned earlier it's an open source tool under the LGPL license. So the easiest thing to do is to read the license statement, but essentially the short answer is yes, you can use the tool, and this is all the idea, to make it available for free. We would love to hear from you when you use it, if you encounter any issue or if it's been successful, or of course, if you're publishing something would it be a scientific article or a research report using the tool? How was your experience? That would be very helpful for us to keep developing the tool together with BTT further.
Thank you, Emanuele. There is another question. Does the tool allow the investigation of multi-period investment planning to couple with the results from a Times Markall style model, such as every 5 years to 2050, showing the increased need of flexibility and renewables, etc., while the existing power system is retired? So, for example, how many gigawatts of coal being decommissioned over the period? Carlos, maybe?
So I don't know if I completely got the questions, but what I understood is if it is possible to couple the Flex tool with long-term models like Times Markall. So we don't have currently the possibility of having a hard link of both tools. So it's now not possible to have a loop that goes from, let's say, a long-term model to the Flex tool and the Flex tool to this long-term model, such as Times. But this is basically what we have been a bit doing with the tool manually. The only thing is that we don't have a hard link with any other modeling tool.
Thank you, Carlos. Another question, for example, where do you see the potential for distributional or distributed renewable energy sources such as PV for households' own self-consumption and demand management mechanisms? Maybe, Carlos, you want to again take this one?
Can you repeat the question?
So where do you see the potential for distributed renewable energy sources such as PV for households? For own self-consumption and demand management mechanisms?
Maybe I can try to jump in on this. So the question, if we understand it correctly, given it's about Flex tool, is not to really answer in general about this, but how does this relate to Flex tool in the specific. So we don't model the distribution grid. This is a dispatch system level tool. But what we do analyze in detail is, again, as we say, the sector coupling, and we also model explicitly demand response. So it's essentially to give more granularity and characterization of the distributed resources and how they impact when we talk about not only PV generation at the distributed level, but also electric vehicles connected to the distribution system and distributed storage, to try to model the flexibility that comes from these resources to the system as a whole, rather than modeling the individual building or trying to model the distribution congestion with different type of analysis.
Oh, sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Emanuele. Another question would be how detailed a system can be represented in terms of a transmission grid and respective nodes.
So I can take this one. So you can really do as much as possible, but it also depends on the computational capabilities of the computer, and also the idea of Flex tool is to do a simplified analysis. So for now, with the biggest let's say analysis we have done is we modeled the Colombian power system with 15 nodes, and the tool can run that granularity well. But of course, if it's needed, the input data files are prepared to run more than 15 nodes, or as much as the user wants.
Thank you, Carlos. And I will take two more before the time runs out. So briefly, if you can briefly describe the features to look out for an initial flexibility assessment.
Emanuele, you take this one, maybe? Or...
Sure, I can do this. So essentially, I think Carlos had a slide on this that was quite clear. What we are essentially trying to do, maybe I can go back to the slide. You still see my slides, so it might take some seconds for you to get a refresh screen. But I think it would be good to have it on screen. So the flexibility issues we look for are essentially the inability of balancing supply and demand. We also look at reserves, so the inability of having at all times the necessary, let's say, security. And when we say security, we, for instance, say that the reserves will take care of contingencies. So we don't do a stability analysis, but if a large-scale generator goes offline or a transmission line disconnects, we do have the necessary reserves in the system at all times. We have ability to ramp the power plants to meet changes in the net load, as is shown in the chart on the right-hand side, and as Carlos already explained. Also, the VRE curtailment should be there. It's part of a least cost mix, but it shouldn't be too large to make the system not economic. So essentially having significant investments that are not recovered. And the same applies to, let's say, curtailment of hydropower. So full reservoirs that are spilling and congested transmission lines. So I guess this is a little bit the framework, and what we do is trying to find solutions to these issues by investing in flexibility, not in one at a time, but in all flexibility options at once, and come up with a least cost mix. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you. And maybe the last question would be, is there any limitations on the size of the power systems being analyzed by the tool, such as the maximum number of power plants represented? Thank you.
So on this one, I would say that the way to represent the power plants, it depends on the size of the system. What I mean by that is there is a linear tool, so there will not be an individual unit commitment. So you would typically group the power plants not at an individual level, but at type level. So you would have gas turbines that could be open cycle, gas turbines that are combined cycle, you would have steam units running on coal, you would have maybe internal combustion engines, and then of course you would have PV with different profiles, but of course you can aggregate the profiles with their own capacity. So you can potentially analyze any size of system. Of course, the computational complexity increases with the number of generators in the system, the number of lines, so the number of nodes and geographical disaggregation of the system. So we've been successfully running analysis for 15 nodes in the case of Colombia. So the country was aggregated to 15 nodes, and that
Emanuele? I'm afraid we lost Emanuele. However, unfortunately, the time is up. A lot of insightful questions to choose from, and so much to learn from you, Emanuele and Carlos. Thank you very much for sharing all these insights and your experience with all of us. Let me finish this very interesting webinar with a couple of final announcements. So to be able to reflect on the delivery of our webinar and ways to improve it, we would appreciate your feedback. We would like to invite you to complete a very short satisfactory survey, which will appear at the end of the webinar, and the link will be shared with you also in the follow-up email. We are monitoring your comments, and we work on selecting topics of your interest and also trying to shift times of webinars to accommodate various time zones. Thank you in advance for completing the survey. And last but not least, unfortunately, we lost Emanuele with a slide, but please download it from the handout section. So we would like to invite you to our special edition of this webinar series with IRENA Innovation and Technology Center Director, Dr. Dolf Gillen, and Dr. Annegret Grubel, the President of the Council of European Energy Regulators, who will discuss COVID-19 and renewables and share with you their insights on consequences faced by the renewable power sector and the initial responses of regulators. It will take place next Thursday on 4th of June at 4 p.m. And then on 9th of June at 3 p.m. Central European Time, we will regather for our next edition, focusing on a newly to be published IRENA flagship report, Renewable Power Generation Costs in 2019, Latest Trends and Drivers. And we will share with you key takeaways and insights into global cost trends for renewable power and what has driven their cost declines in 2019. You can register for both webinars on IRENA website, and the links are shared with you in the presentation, and also you will receive a follow-up email with the links. So that is all from us for today. Once again, thank you, Emanuele and Carlos, and all of you for joining us today. Goodbye and see you soon.